In this render, I just have a very simple object, basically what could be a cabinet door, with cubic mapping mode with the wood texture. Now, from far away, this might work, but for the most part, it has some issues. And it's not very realistic because the way it's designed. And the way things are, and this object would be designed in real life, is we would have multiple pieces joined together, and the texture wouldn't be overlapping the way it is. We would have some separations in the grain, and also a direction change in the grain for the top and the bottom piece. And a very simple way to fix this, really depending on the object you're working with, for the most part, it'll work with just about any object. It really just has to do with manipulating the UV and creating a UV map that will work well with the texture. So if we were to take a look at this and the individual pieces, which I've already created a UV map and just basically taken the polygons for each piece and overlaid a color on them. In order to really show this, we have 5 primary pieces. Our top and bottom piece, and then the left and the right. And the way this is set up, we have a nice break in the grain and the pattern with a design that would be just like it would be made in real life. And I'm using a corner joint basically because I beveled the outer edges of this to design it. And if I was to use more of a square joint on the corners, then it would probably be easier to model it that way, the way the pieces are designed. But the object itself is all one piece. All the polygons are connected together. And by using the corner method, I was just able to unwrap the UV specific to this object. So if we take a look at the object itself and its polygons, we can just see something very simple. And I have the front and back polygon basically matching up, or at least as close as possible. I would technically need to rotate around the UV to get it to match up perfectly. But we can see the 4 different pieces, and I just have those unwrapped in the UV. And if we take a look at the UV map, you can see all of our side pieces, and then I also have the back panel and then the front panel. Now technically these are a little narrow, so I would need to modify that just a little. Because the shape of the object is a little bit wider than what I have for the UV. So what I could technically do right now, just to even that out, is select these points and just move them over. And we can see that expanding within the texture, and it looks a little bit better. Now, if you take a look at our side pieces, you can see I have the scale. And we'll just go ahead and expand that. And the scale is matched up. That's because we want the most consistency in the texture scale throughout the object. We don't want to have any areas where the texture just drastically changes size. Now, for the most part, this is pretty flexible. But what I've done is really made sure that those match up. And I've also offset them just a little bit to really disperse the grain and positioning throughout the object. What I could also do is maybe put these panels in the center and move these around while still trying to fit within our square area, just so we can make the most of our texture rather than having a bunch of unused image file size. And it's also important to keep in mind the smoothing angle that we have on the surface, because we don't have a lot of geometry. This is a very low poly model. We might need to adjust the Phong angle or smoothing angle, depending on the application you're using, in order to get something that looks a little more realistic without having to add too much geometry. Without a Phong angle and just using completely flat polygons, you can really see how the geometry is pulled out. In this case, I would want to round out sort of the outer edge a little, but keep some of the main separations more flat, and that way that's not too smoothed out, and it'll really affect the specular values if it's set too high. So keeping that in mind while you're modeling too. So if we were to separate the surface and create our UV map, really for this we'd have to go in and select the polygons we want. And really depending on the tools you're using, depending on the program, there's different ways to create your UV map. So now I'm just going to select this top section, and we can see the automatic UV that was created really isn't going to work. We can set that to a flat projection, and now we can see that is basically unwrapped, although we do have one problem, which is this face on the top would need to be manipulated. So whether or not you would need to separate that, maybe use a different mapping mode. But in this case, I do want to stick with the flat. And what I would need to do, I'm just going to go ahead and move this where we can see it a little bit better. So we need to pull out those points in back. And keeping in mind too, whenever you're working with the UV, you're going to be selecting multiple groups of points connected to the other polygons. So you will need to deselect normally in the UV layout and the view. So then what we can do is just pull out those points, and we do want it to be fairly consistent and with the size compared to the rest of the surface area. So that's about the same width as the front-facing polygon, so we would make it just about the same size as that one. Now if we take a look at the angle and the size this was created, it really isn't going to completely work for some of the areas. And the angle we have for the model is a 45-degree angle on every corner. So whenever we extract any of these pieces, we need to make sure that the scale we end up with keeps those angles at 45 degrees. So in this case, what we would have to do is scale down those polygons, and I'm going to reduce their X scale to a point where we have a 45-degree angle or as close to it as possible. If there's too much stretching, it's going to really manipulate the texture, and it is not going to look right. And because I'm working with the top piece, and our texture has the grain going vertically, we would need to rotate this. So in this case, I would apply just a rotation 90 degrees and rotate that to the side. And that way we can manipulate the grain without having to change the image. And if you're using the same method to extract all the pieces, really looking at that angle is the best way to tell if everything is sized correctly. And since these front-facing polygons are exactly the same on the trim, that makes it even easier. We can overlay the different polygon extractions for the UV and just match the scale that way if we need to get it to fit within our area. For the front and back, really what I did was just take what was automatically created and change the scale to match up just a little bit better. And then I just kind of move that off to the side. Keeping in mind too, the smaller the polygon gets, the higher of a resolution we're going to need for some of these larger areas. So this texture is 2048 by 2048. For a close-up render, 1024 by 1024 really wouldn't work all that well. So once all the pieces are extracted, you can organize them to fit. I've got the top and bottom right on top of each other and flipped around too to also help distribute the texture. And it's really a matter of mixing it throughout the material. So if we were to take a look at this with the overlay of the texture itself, and I just have a Photoshop file with the UV polygons overlaid on top of the texture so that you can see exactly where everything's going to show up. Now this is with the version where before I moved the points for the UV of the front and back panel, so that might not be matching up perfectly, but you can see exactly where everything needs to line up. So if you need to make modifications to the UV or the texture map, having this sort of overlay can make it extremely useful and helpful when designing any sort of texture. So if you wanted to have maybe a dirtier edge along each of the joints, you could either use the burn tool or set up a different layer and just manipulate the surface that way. Let's just go ahead and do that right now, something you'd be able to see. And I already have a duplicate layer of the texture. I'm going to turn that on. And then I also had just those colors from before. Just overlaying and showing each of the panels in the color. I'm going to turn that off. Get rid of the color group. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is just burn the edges. Going to the burn tool. I'm going to do this on shadows. And what we can do is just darken up the edges here. And I am going to select midtones first and do a first pass, and then go over to shadows. And that'll give us a little better desaturating color value. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that really quick. So now I just have all the edges burned, and it's usually a good idea to make sure that you turn off that overlay before you go ahead and save it out. In this case, the color I ended up with is a little too green. I could always go ahead and modify that, but I'm just going to stick with that for right now. The overlay can also be useful for other types of texture creation, or even just avoiding render times with certain effects. In this case, since we have basically a black line for every polygon edge, what we could do is basically fake an ambient occlusion just by using this surface, blurring it out. And that will darken all of the edges on our polygons, provided the overlay is completely matched. Depending on the technique you use to get the overlay onto your texture, might be a little bit of an offset. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a copy. And it is darkening the overall document as well because of the color I'm using. But what we could do is just set up a little bit of a Gaussian blur to affect all of our edges. And I'm going to set this to color burn. And now we can have these darker edges around the entire polygon face. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this out, and then we can load it up onto the object and take a look at it. And now with the manipulated color map and also the diffusion map using that overlay, we can really pull out a lot more detail out of the model and also turn down the falling angle because they require less geometry and smoothing to really pull out some of those details. Now the inside, I would also want to create that sort of an effect. So I'm just going to go back into Photoshop really quick and use that burn tool again just to modify that inner edge, and we can take a look at a render. So now we can see the more dirtied up panel in the center. But also keep in mind, this is one drawback to the method I used, having the front and back polygon overlapping, is that if we were to take a look in the back, we're going to see that texture showing up in the back, which isn't going to be very consistent. In this case, if we wanted to be able to preserve this or have just the straight texture without that dirtied area, then we would have to separate the UV. Now, the reason I set it up like this is primarily to save space within the UV. If we take a look at it, we can see if I was to separate this panel, it's really not going to fit in without having to really reduce the scale of all of the entire polygon set, which in turn would require a much larger texture in order to render close-ups. In most cases, you probably won't be getting super close to your object, so that might not be that huge of an issue. One thing you can do to reduce file size is cut out bits of the texture around the object. So what we could do to reduce the overall file size is just add a new layer in this case, and the lack of color is really the best way to do this. And I only had the opacity set to 50%, which is why the burn tool before wasn't fully applying itself. So what I'm going to do is just merge, create a copy first, merge those two together, and then I'm going to put this white background behind this object. And what we would want to do is really just kind of cut out, just drawing around, and delete any area of the texture that we do not need and that is not going to be showing up. So this would be definitely final stage after everything has been finalized with the texture. You can go around the polygons, making sure you do leave a little bit of an overlap area just in case there is a slight difference between your overlay and the actual UV. So you could just go in and kind of cut that out, and that's going to really help reduce the file size. What you could also do, just in case there was any sort of overlap, is instead of using a white background, what we could do is set up just a color overlay and pick one of the edge colors from the texture. That way, in case there is a little bit of an overlap where you've accidentally cut out a piece, if it shows up, it's going to blend together a little bit better rather than being a really bright white color. And that takes just as much information as just any other solid color. So it doesn't really matter what color you use, just as long as there's not so much detail, and that'll really help cut down those file sizes. So if we take a look a little bit closer, although we can start to see some deterioration of the image because we are so close to it, for the most part, this will work really well. And really, depending on which tool you're using and which major 3D application, Cinema has a lot of different ways to really improve the quality once you get close up. If we look at the material editor, these sampling modes will really allow you to disperse and sort of smooth out some of those areas. You could blur them if needed. So really the sampling amount could be very helpful. And if we just take a look from farther away, we can see it looks pretty good. And this is without ambient occlusion or global illumination on, just using the outline technique to kind of fill in those edges. And the scene itself just has 3 lights, so it's fairly basic, not a whole lot to it, but enough to get the point across, and so you really be able to see what's going on. What you could also do, if the edge maybe isn't dark enough between the joint, you could darken that up a bit more, but for the most part, I think this looks pretty good. And really not that bad considering it's a 100% CG texture. If you did want to help the color a little, you could use the color matching tool in Photoshop with a custom designed wood, and using that with an image, an existing texture, basically just cutting out the wood color, and that will help match up to something real world. And to do that, you can go into Photoshop and under Image and Adjustments, select Match Color. And this tool is covered in another portion of this training. And there's just one last thing I want to note about this, and that is I did end up using just the color map for the specular diffusion because the overall tones and gradients really ended up looking a lot better than just the black and white or leveled grayscale, although that is what I'm using for the bump map. But for the diffusion and specular lighting, the color map seemed to work really well. So if we take a look at the diffusion, I'm just using the same exact image as the color, and I just have a little bit of mixed strength, just slightly affecting the diffusion, making sure it does affect the specular value. If we go ahead and just, for fun, go ahead and crank up the highlight, so we can really see the effect. And because I do have 2 lights, it might be a little difficult to see what's going on. So I'll just go ahead and move this light so it's not so direct onto the surface. And you can even see in the OpenGL a pretty decent preview of what the render is going to look like. So we can see something a little higher gloss. In this case, with that high of a specular value, I would want to make sure that diffusion is all the way up. And if needed, you can adjust the contrast of the image, or in this case, we could go over, and it doesn't look like we can go over 100% with the mix strength. And some of the values you can go over 100% and some of them you can't. So now with 100% mix value of that texture, you can see something dispersed a little bit better. And we'll try to find a little bit of a better angle right around top here. And that mixed with the bump map can create a pretty neat looking effect and a really good wood surface. Even mixing those two together would also create something that looks a little bit better. So it's really up to you what you want to do with these tools and combination of this imagery. Another thing you could do is create a different type of diffusion, or even using another material's diffusion to really create a more interesting looking specular map. If you want something a little more worn, that could be more helpful rather than using one from the same texture. Or you create an overlay, something like that, if you're going to be creating more of a worn wood look. So there's really a lot you can do with it, and it makes it a lot easier setting it up this way rather than having to separate polygon surfaces, give them different surface names, deal with different Phong angles, having separate material maps. So just with a really simple UV and just paying attention to how you model your object, it's a good way to work with the wood surface.